So up next, we have the previous speaker who switched spaces with Leonie, Kimberly Muñoz. She comes to us from Slack, where she works on accessibility and on slack.com. She's been making websites accessible for a fairly long time. I'll let her tell you how many years, because you're not supposed to ask that question. That's rude. And the other thing is, not only has she worked at Slack, which is a terrific product and really needs accessibility help, but she also used to work for the Consumer Financial, basically the federal bureau that's supposed to help us not get screwed over by banks, which is no longer, it's hanging on by a thread.
We're still there. We're hanging on.
Okay. So hopefully it'll survive the next 3 years. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kimberly.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use Semantic HTML to build performant accessible sites. So my name is Kimberly. I'm a front-end developer at Slack, where I build web pages that you may have seen on slack.com. Prior to working at Slack, like Estelle mentioned, I was a developer with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a federal government agency looking out for your financial rights. And I did some nonprofit and campaign work at organizations like Share Progress and Rebuild the Dream. If you have any questions, I will share my email at the end, and feel free to @ me. So the main purpose of my talk is to encourage developers to use Semantic HTML. And Semantic HTML is markup that reinforces the meaning of the page with how we code it. And the reason that we want to use it is because it can be better understood by machines, screen readers, and your fellow human developers who are working with you trying to read your code whenever there's bugs in there. So this is not a mystery of what this looks like. You've probably seen semantic elements before. And if you haven't, I recommend Mozilla Developer Network, MDN, as a great resource for learning more about these. I'm going to talk about two main groupings of semantic elements. I'm going to talk about landmarks and regions, and also some form elements, and some of the stuff that goes into them and why we would want to use them. And before I dive into that, I do want to talk a little bit about why we're talking about accessibility. I think Leonie's talk did an amazing job of kind of diving into why we want to do this. But if you aren't convinced, there are a number of reasons. You may want to follow ADA compliance or 508 compliance if you're taking federal funding or working for a school. There's also a broader audience that you're going to reach. And if you're self-interested and also just want to make a better website, we have to build accessible websites because it is creating a better experience for everyone. When something is keyboard navigable, you can access it with a screen reader, you can access it with a keyboard, you can access it with a switch device. And when something has color contrast, you can see it in the very back of the auditorium, as well as with poor vision. So when we're working on making accessible websites, we're really working on making websites that work better for all of our users. So with that in mind, let's get started with one of the easier ways of making a website accessible in a performant way, and that's looking at using Semantic HTML for focus management. So focus management is how we make sure that your site is navigable by keyboard in a way that makes sense. For people in the accessibility world, there is a set of guidelines with all of the rules that you need to follow in order to make an accessible site called the WCAG, and they have a very dry description that I could read out about how we want to navigate sequentially, and the navigation sequences affect the meaning and operation of focusable components. And basically what this means is we want to make sure that people can tab through the website and access anything that should receive focus, such as a button or a link or form element. And the reason why we want to do this is because if it can be accessed by your keyboard tabbing and shift tabbing to go backwards, it can be accessed by assistive technology. So this is an example from slack.com. It even includes an invisible until you need it skip nav link at the very top to skip repetitive navigation. When I was working for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, government agency, we had a lot of links in the nav, and having something like this was a little bit more critical, even with a very robust nav that we built. And another thing that we also want to do is we want to make sure that our focus is visible, that we can always see where we're navigating, so that we aren't going off screen and navigating to things that you're not supposed to click on, that you can always tell where you are, you don't have to get lost, so that folks that aren't using assistive devices and maybe are just tabbing through can also take advantage of this feature. So the most performant way of doing this is to make sure that you are focusing on your DOM order. You want to make sure that your visual layout matches the way that you've ordered things in the DOM. If you don't do this, you'll have to retrofit accessibility on there by doing focus management with things like .blur and .focus, and you can end up in some sticky situations. So for websites where you're trying to do this after it's all been built, you don't have the time to reorder the DOM. You'll have to make sure that you're taking into account things like backwards tabbing, people who are navigating via links and maybe pop in the middle, and if things shift around with different breakpoints, you want to make sure that it works there. Obviously, this all adds a lot of additional JavaScript and a lot of additional code that developers have to work around, and it's very fragile. It can break. So best practice is always just to keep your code performant by focusing on the DOM order. Another thing I want to mention is that we want to make sure to use semantic elements like button and select whenever possible. And sometimes there's a little bit of hesitancy around this because we don't know what these elements do for us. And I am sharing up on the screen some code from the ARIA practices note. And what this is basically the same code that it would take in order to do a button with just plain divs. We have to add a tab index in order to make it focusable. We have to add a role in order for the screen reader to get that information from the accessibility tree that this is a button. And we have to add not only click handlers, but also keyboard. We have to track a keyboard press for both enter and space, because that is what buttons do for us. And this is the simplest of form elements. If we're talking about radio buttons and checkboxes, we're going to also have to manage ARIA checked or ARIA selected, and it's critical that we get those things right, because if we don't, then the screen reader will have no way of knowing that that information is wrong. So another reason that I think developers sometimes shy away from custom elements is that they don't think that they can be styled. And although there are some limitations, there is a little bit of flexibility that you can do with semantic elements and styling. At the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we worked on an open source framework for all of our websites, Capital Framework, and we developed different stylings for things like selects, inputs, radio buttons, made them very big because we want to make sure that our resources were accessible to all folks, even older Americans who need larger tap areas. And most of these elements we customized without using additional JavaScript. And it's something that you can do, and you have that extra benefit there. The other reason we want to do this is also there's a little bit of a performance benefit, a perceived performance benefit from using semantic elements. If you don't have to wait for everything to come in, you don't have to wait for the fonts and everything, you can start using it a little bit faster. The other thing that I wanted to go into is things like validation. That in HTML5, we now have the ability to have validation handled by the browser, and it's pretty accessible in modern browsers. So there are a number of different inputs. There are there's tel equals telephone, which gives you a nice little keyboard on your, or type equals tel, which gives you a nice little keyboard on your mobile device just like a keypad so that you can type in your telephone number into a form. Same for email. And if you add required to these fields, it will look for blank fields for you and warn the user with a little tooltip provided by the browser. It'll also do some light validation so that you never have to write a regex to validate email, even though that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't do that. If you don't want to use this validation because you have your own validation for your website, you just slap no validate on the form and you can take advantage of that. The other thing that some of these HTML5 input types offer you is a custom input, like on date picker. If you do use type equals date, you get a custom date picker. The quality of this date picker varies for browsers, which kind of gets into the downsides of these things. Browser support is a little different from browser to browser. You may have a project manager who's wondering why your tooltips look different on Safari versus Chrome. You'll have to explain that. And that on older browsers, this isn't as supported, so you always want to make sure that you're using backup validation. But that is a general rule with front-end validation in general. The other thing is also just on long forms, this might not be the most robust solution, but for certain cases, you can take advantage of what the browser can give you with these semantic elements. So one caveat is that this all works for input types, but if you're using content editables in order to do more advanced work, so far there isn't a way to take advantage of that, but that is changing in Chrome 66. We'll have input mode, which will allow you to have some of these features, and so that's coming down the pipeline. And the biggest benefit, I think, from writing semantic code is that it does lead towards more maintainable modular code. At Slack.com, we use a framework to write very modular CSS, and we try to avoid, in our powers, to just never do a code base like this. Anything with like lots of divs, lots of not very useful classes, and who knows what's going on in there. The reason we don't want to do this is, I get anxious just looking at it. I don't want to touch it. I'm not going to delete it. This is going to lead to bloat. But also, it's not giving a lot of information to the screen reader. It's not very useful. This is a code base that's suffering from divitis. It has very bloated, hard to style markup, and we want to avoid that whenever possible. So using semantic classes and very like modular based CSS, we can make sure that all of our styles are together. If we're not using anything anymore, I can delete with confidence, reduce the amount of code that we're forcing our users to download, and be very disciplined about that. One thing I'm going to stop and kind of investigate with my little emoji here is that nav tag. So as Leonie was describing, that information, the screen reader can navigate through things like landmarks. And so on most pages that use HTML5 landmarks, you can use your screen reader to open up a window like this. It'll describe it. It'll imagine it's spoken in that robotic voice. And what people can do is they can navigate to the main part of your website, skip all the nav links. They can navigate to the footer. They can navigate to the aside. What this looks like on a page, so this is an example from a page I developed at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is something like this, where all of the header code is together, all of the nav code is together, and all of the main and the aside code is together, and people can navigate through them. But back to the performance benefits. I wanted to mention that, I wanted to mention that part of the reason that we want to do this is that we want to have very modular code. We want to banish old dead code. This was going to be a little GIF of like bad code going away, dead code going away. We want it out of our code base. Once this see it, and that leads to a performance benefit there. But we want to make sure that we can take advantage of new performance technology. So we want to make sure that if we are still bundling our CSS in a large bundle, that we aren't including things that we don't need. This is a way that we
sometimes bundle CSS on some sites with one large bundle. There's some benefits to doing this way. There's a lot of, you can cache it across the web, across all of your websites, but it might not be optimal depending on how people navigate your site. It might make more sense to do per page CSS if people are only hitting 1 or 2 pages and then bouncing. With HTTP2, we have a little bit more flexibility to give people our CSS in little modules. Again, be sure to actually test with your users and make sure that this makes sense for your audience. But it's something that we have access to and something that we can try. The one thing is that we can't get to CSS bundles like this if we have a lot of repeated code, if we don't use modular CSS. So we want to go towards that. Some resources for getting to more modular CSS and more modular code and using semantic HTML. I highly recommend Laura Hogan's Designing for Performance. It's a great book with a lot of these practices outlined. And also, if you want to learn more about accessibility and some of the things that you can do with more customized widgets, because this is all fairly like 101 and basic, I highly recommend looking at the ARIA practices document and looking at some of the examples. They have a lot of code examples. This just went through a major cleanup on this note last December, and it's open source and ready for anyone to like add any information that they need. So thank you so much for your time. Email me if you have any questions.